In February 1979, millions of Iranians flooded the streets of Tehran to welcome a man who had been exiled for 15 years. But long before Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini stepped off that airplane, a revolution had already begun, and it had been spreading through Iran on smuggled cassette tapes. I am Doris Smith, an independent journalist, and this is the Journalism of Everything. Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran after 15 years of exile in 1979. But prior to his return, the Iranians had been revolting, and Shah Pahlavi had fled the country. Shah Pahlavi was universally disliked throughout Iran, especially amongst religious clerics and conservatives, the merchant class, farmers, laborers, and workers, and students. Not only had the economy crashed, the Shah became much more authoritarian, and his secret police, Savik, terrorized anyone who opposed him. Savik arrested dissidents, detained them without due process, and even tortured them. And while this was happening, Khomeini recorded sermons on cassette tapes while in exile, and then had them smuggled into the country to be played subversively in mosques, bazaars, and homes throughout Iran. Khomeini communicated several types of messages in these tapes with some common themes. Khomeini argued that the Shah was illegitimate because he betrayed Islam, and he was controlled by foreign powers, and he kind of had a point there. Khomeini urged Iranians to revolt against the Shah as an act to reclaim the Iranian religion and culture as their own without foreign influence. Khomeini was a big believer that Islamic law was a complete system to rule every facet of Iranians' lives, but he also lightened his message in order to gain support with less conservative Iranians. Many Iranians did not know that Khomeini actually would implement an austere and strict form of theocracy when he did gain power. He framed revolution as a religious and moral obligation, and that message resonated with many Shiite Muslims, both hardliners and moderates. By the late 1970s, Iran's economy was in major meltdown, and this seemed to be the final piece of the puzzle to make Iranians from all walks and beliefs revolt against the Shah. Under Pahlavi, Iran had experienced a significant oil boom that earned Iranian government record profits. Pahlavi spent these profits on infrastructure and industrial improvements, as well as the military. While this sounds great, inflation also soared up to 25% in 1977, and it led to massive social disruption. The lower and middle class could no longer afford housing or food because of this inflation. People saw the government getting richer without seeing any improvements in their lives. Is this foreshadowing to what's happening in the United States? The Iranian government tried to reduce inflation with austerity policies that backfired and have been seen as one of the largest miscalculations leading to the revolutions. Pahlavi slowed government spending, which led to less construction projects and more unemployment in that industry. Pahlavi also throttled the banks, limiting the lending, tightening loan approvals, and reducing financing for construction and new businesses. So this just slowed the growth of the economy even more. The Shah also applied major sanctions on anyone he deemed to be price gouging, placing strict controls on goods and hurting the merchant class, or the bazaris, who became a major player in the revolution. Pahlavi put limits on wage increases in certain industries as well, though these policies were blind to the continued rising costs of housing in urban areas. So urban workers were limited in how much they could earn, yet their housing costs continued to increase with inflation. Kind of like keeping federal minimum wage at $7.25 an hour since 2009. Pahlavi's austerity measures were too aggressive and applied too quickly, so unemployment went way up and the economy got worse, especially for the lower and middle class. A tale as old as time, the middle and lower classes continued to get poorer, while the royal court, military elites, and government business groups and contractors got richer from oil wealth. But by 1978, the wealthy Iranians fled Iran due to economic insecurity, and an estimated $30 to $40 billion of capital fled the country just before the revolution. By 1978, urban workers, including oil workers, began to protest and strike, and these protests shut down Iranian factories, banks, logistics, and oil production. Pahlavi's government became defunct because it had no money coming in from oil production, which was its biggest industry. In January 1978, Shah Pahlavi published a smear article in the government-controlled newspaper Etellatat against Ruhollah Khomeini. The article's title in English was, quote, "Iran and Red and Black Colonialism," end quote. The article made several inflammatory claims against Khomeini that did not go well in the eyes of the public. The article claimed that Khomeini was himself being controlled by Britain and that his roots were actually Indian and he was not a true Iranian. Khomeini had familial claims to the Prophet Muhammad, so this claim was not only insulting, but largely seen as inaccurate and purposely inflammatory. The article accused him of being a communist ally and insinuated that Khomeini was not a holy cleric, but instead power-hungry, immoral, and manipulating religion for politics. This article was a huge miscalculation for Shah Pahlavi. He thought that Khomeini was actually fading in relevance, while the opposite was true. He thought that the clerics would turn against Khomeini, while instead they sided with Khomeini and felt further betrayed by Pahlavi. The Shah also thought that the urban middle class would side with him because they wanted more modernization in Iran, but they were already upset with the Shah, so insulting a highly respected religious cleric further made them support Khomeini. Even though Khomeini remained alive and well in exile, people within Iran treated him like a martyr and began a massive series of protests that led to violent clashes with the Iranian government. After the article was released, students from Qom, a city with many well-known seminaries, including the one Khomeini went to, marched in the streets, chanting against the Shah. Unfortunately, government security forces opened fire, killing an unknown number of students. In Shiite Muslim tradition, there are mourning ceremonies 40 days after someone dies. Because of this tradition, the protest cycle was sustained as each mourning cycle began. So with each new mourning cycle, they had new protests. Security forces opened fire, killing more people, and the protests in the mourning cycle just continued. By September 7th, 1978, the Shah declared martial law in Tehran. He established a curfew, prohibited public gatherings, and he authorized the army to suppress any demonstrations. Unfortunately, not everyone knew that martial law had been declared. On September 8th, thousands of protesters gathered in Jaleh Square. These protesters were a mix of people, from students and workers, religious activists, and just ordinary Tehran residents unhappy with their quality of lives and unhappy with the Shah and his administration. The protesters had several demands, including the removal of the Shah from power, more political freedom, and for Khomeini to return from exile. While the military tried to quell the protesters with less lethal means initially, they ended up firing on the protesters, killing 64 in Jaleh Square alone. Rumors flew around the country that thousands had been killed, and even though this number was an exaggeration, it fueled anger against the regime. September 8th, 1978 was Black Friday in Iran. It was a no turning back moment for many against the Shah. It showed that there was no more negotiating with the Shah and further spurred support for Khomeini to return and for the Shah and his government to leave Iran. Just 4 months later, on January 16th, 1979, Shah Pahlavi fled Iran. Not only was the government out of money, but the economy was completely crippled and protests around the country were expansive. Military officers were no longer willing to shoot protesters in support of the Shah. He lost the military. Some government bureaucrats and civil servants previously loyal to the Shah joined the nationwide strikes. And the wealthy elites, who had also supported the Shah, were fleeing, bringing their money and investments with them. Shah Pahlavi made a last-ditch effort to calm the revolution. He released some political prisoners, loosened the censorship on the press, and appointed a moderate, Shapur Bakhtir, as prime minister. By this time, though, Iranians wanted the monarchy gone. The Shah also was very ill, suffering from lymphoma, and he fled to seek medical help. His original plan was to leave for treatment, hoping that he could return when things calmed down. Instead, Iranians whooped it up, and on February 1st, 1979, Khomeini returned from his exile. He was greeted by millions of Iranians, and the masses celebrated, for their savior had returned. 10 days after Khomeini returned, the Iranian military declared that they were neutral, and the monarchy completely collapsed. When Khomeini returned to Iran, Western leaders did not know how powerful he had become and did not expect him to take control in the manner in which he did. Khomeini didn't take over in a dramatic coup, but he did wait for the monarchy to collapse in February while also consolidating his power. Khomeini essentially created a government to compete with the Shah with the government the Shah had left in place. He appointed Mehdi Bazargan, an interim leader. He declared that because he had appointed Bazargan, the government must be obeyed as God's government. He created parallel revolutionary institutions to bypass the old state, including the Islamic Revolutionary Council, revolutionary committees that were basically local militias supporting the revolution, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which was essentially the military for the revolution. He created his own court system, the Islamic Revolutionary Courts, which in turn punished officials of the Shah's regime. Within months, hundreds of former military officers and government officials were executed. While Khomeini was in exile, he gained support from those who were more secular and leftist. But after he returned, these allies realized that he was much more fundamentalist and conservative than they expected. These former allies had no place in the future of the revolution. In March 1979, Khomeini implemented a national referendum asking Iranian voters whether Iran should become an Islamic Republic. About 98% of Iranians voted in favor of Iran becoming an Islamic Republic. While certainly many Iranians were against the monarchy and in favor of a more moderate Islamic Republic Khomeini had previously presented, the March 1979 referendum wasn't entirely democratic. The constitution for this Islamic Republic hadn't even been written yet. So Iranians were really just voting for something other than the monarchy, and they didn't have any other options. And of course, the monarchy was extremely unpopular, so they were like, okay, well, we don't want that. They wouldn't find out until later what Khomeini's Islamic Republic really looked like. There is a lesson in what happened in Iran after World War II until the late 1970s, and that is that the West should not interfere with other governments. History tells us over and over that when we interfere, we create a power vacuum, and usually within that power vacuum, something worse or counterproductive to our interests fills that void. When we interfere with another country's culture, religion, and well-being, we create dissidents. And dissidents are unpredictable, and they cannot be controlled. The U.S. has a history of arrogance in how we gather intelligence, and we often underestimate the opposition that forms in relation to our interference, whether this is political, military, or even social. We can draw similar parallels between our interference in Iran during the Cold War, especially ousting a democratically elected leader in favor of an authoritarian leader that we can control in our war in Iran now in 2026. We are bombing schools, oil sites, poisoning citizens in Tehran, all in concert with Israel. And the least, we are creating a hatred of the United States within Iran. We think we can go in there and bully them into submission, but their reactions will be unpredictable, not easily controlled, and most likely will result in a government or enemy that is much worse than what we started with. In the next episode, we will talk about the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis, which lasted 444 days and solidified Khomeini's power in Iran. It also solidified that Iran was no longer America's ally.